A 6-year-old's bold statement, "Mommy is lying," left the courtroom in utter shock. The atmosphere felt thick, as if everyone was collectively holding their breath. Fluorescent lights cast a harsh, sterile glow on the wood-paneled walls. Rows of strangers filled the benches, a mix of curious onlookers and a few family members. On the far left sat a little black boy, no older than 6, his legs too short to reach the ground. He swung them nervously, the soles of his sneakers lightly tapping against the polished wood. Next to him was his mother, dressed in a navy blazer that seemed slightly oversized, as if borrowed for the occasion. Her hair was perfectly styled, and her makeup was subtle yet carefully applied. She clutched the tissue in one hand, frequently glancing at her lawyer, who whispered reassurances. The boy, however, was different. His large brown eyes scanned the room, taking in every detail. While his face held an innocent expression, his furrowed brows revealed a worry far too heavy for his age. Opposite them sat a tall white man with graying hair and a tense posture, dressed in an expensive, perfectly tailored suit. His expression was anything but calm. This was not merely a legal dispute, it was personal, as he was the boy's father, fighting for custody. At the center of the proceedings was the judge, a woman in her 60s with sharp, calculating eyes. She wore her years of experience like armor, her expression unyielding as she observed the unfolding scene. Although she had presided over many cases, something about this one felt different. Perhaps it was the weight of unspoken truths in the air or the boy's restless movements that drew her attention. When the courtroom fell silent, the judge adjusted her glasses and addressed the mother, saying, "You may proceed." The mother cleared her throat and sat up straighter, gripping her tissue more tightly. The sound of her lawyer's chair scraping against the floor broke the silence as he rose to begin questioning. No one in that room could have predicted what was about to unfold, not even the judge. Yet, something about the boy's wide, tear-filled eyes suggested that the truth was on the verge of coming out. The mother's lawyer spoke in a slow, deliberate tone, as if trying to set a measured pace for the proceedings. "Miss Hamilton," he said, stepping closer to the witness stand, "please tell the court why you believe you should retain full custody of your son." She straightened in her seat, her voice soft yet strong. "Your Honor, I have been my son's primary caregiver since the day he was born. I provided for him, nurtured him, and ensured he has everything he needs to thrive." She paused, glancing at the boy on the bench for strength. "I know his routines, his fears, and his dreams. I've sacrificed my career, my personal life, everything, to make sure he feels safe and loved." Her words were carefully chosen and polished, carrying a heavy emotional weight. She dabbed her eyes with the tissue as she continued, "I don't deny that his father cares for him, but he hasn't been there in the way our son deserves. He's missed birthdays, school events, and even doctor's appointments. A parent can't just pick and choose when to show up." The father's lawyer shifted in his seat, preparing for a rebuttal, but Miss Hamilton wasn't finished. "I'm not perfect, Your Honor, but everything I do is for my son. He's my entire world." The room was still, save for the sound of the judge's pen scratching on paper. The boy sat quietly, staring at his shoes, but something had changed in his posture. His shoulders were tense, and his small hands clenched into fists in his lap. The mother's lawyer prepared to conclude, saying, "Thank you, Miss Hamilton. Your Honor, I believe it's clear who has the child's best interests at heart." The judge nodded slightly, signaling for the next phase. However, as the silence lingered, the boy's small voice cut through the air. "Mommy's lying." Though he didn't shout, his words were clear enough for everyone to hear. Heads turned sharply toward the boy. The mother froze, her face draining of color, while even the judge looked startled, pausing mid-stroke with her pen. However, no one could fully grasp the weight of those two words, not yet. The courtroom became still, the boy's small voice slicing through the heavy silence like a knife. "Mommy's lying." He repeated his words, his voice trembling yet resolute. Every eye in the room shifted toward him, including the judge's, who leaned forward ever so slightly. The judge's expression remained unreadable, but her attention was undeniably piqued. The mother snapped her head towards her son, her composed exterior starting to crack. "Honey," she said, her voice dropping to a low, urgent tone. "This isn't the right time for you to speak." The judge intervened, her tone calm yet firm. She looked directly at the boy, her eyes softening just enough to coax him. "What do you mean, young man? Why do you believe your mommy is lying?" The boy's small hands fidgeted nervously in his lap as his gaze flicked between his mother and the judge. Tears welled up in his large brown eyes, yet he remained steadfast. She says everything is for me," he whispered, his voice barely audible, "but that's not true. She doesn't even want me talking to Daddy." A collective gasp filled the room. The father, who had been sitting quietly, leaned forward, clearly stunned by the boy's words. The mother's face remained impassive, though the panic was evident, her lips parting to protest, yet no sound escaped. The boy gathered more courage. "She tells me Daddy is bad, that he doesn't love me, but that's not true. Daddy always tries to call me. He sends me letters and pictures, but she hides them." The judge raised an eyebrow and glanced toward the mother, who looked as though the ground beneath her might collapse. The father's lawyer seized the moment. "Your Honor, this is a significant statement. May I request that the court allow this child to elaborate?" The judge nodded, keeping her gaze on the boy. "Take your time, sweetheart. Tell us everything you'd like us to know." The boy hesitated for a moment, biting his lip, before glancing back at his mother. His voice trembled once more. "She told me to say bad things about Daddy," he whispered. "She said if I didn't, I might not get to stay with her." The room erupted in murmurs, and the judge slammed her gavel. "Order. Order in the court." The mother's lawyer quickly stood, his voice frantic. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular." "Sit down," the judge snapped sharply, her tone frosty. She turned back to the boy, her expression softening again. "You're doing very well. Is there anything else you'd like to share?" The boy nodded, his tiny shoulders rising and falling as he took a deep breath. "I just want to see my daddy. I miss him." As his words hung heavily in the air, the mother's carefully crafted narrative began to crumble, and everyone in the courtroom knew it was irreversible. The silence that followed was thick with the weight of the boy's testimony. The judge leaned back in her chair, narrowing her eyes as she absorbed the gravity of the situation. "Miss Hamilton," she said, addressing the mother directly, "do you have a response to your son's statement?" The mother, visibly shaken, struggled to maintain her composure. Her hands trembled as she gripped the tissue tighter, her knuckles growing pale. "Your Honor," she stammered, "he's just a child. He doesn't fully understand the situation. All I'd ever wanted was to protect him." At that moment, the father's lawyer pounced. "Protect him, Your Honor." This boy's testimony strongly suggests a deliberate effort to turn him against his father. We ask that the court seriously consider this revelation and reevaluate the evidence provided. The judge raised her hand, signaling for silence. She then turned her attention back to the boy, her voice gentle. "Do you feel safe right now, sweetheart? You can tell me anything." The boy nodded, his eyes briefly flicking to his mother before returning to the judge. "I feel safe, but I don't like when Mommy says those things about Daddy." He paused for a moment, then continued. "He didn't forget my birthday. He came to the school to give me a card, but Mommy said I wasn't allowed to see him." Across the courtroom, the father placed his hand over his mouth, his face a mixture of disbelief and heartbreak. His lawyer whispered something in his ear, but the father's gaze remained locked on his son. The judge scribbled a few notes before addressing the court clerk. "I'd like to review any communication records between both parents." She ordered the phone logs, emails, and anything else relevant to the case. The mother's lawyer stood up again, his voice trembling but firm. "Your Honor, I must object to this line of questioning. My client has adhered to all custody agreements, and there is no solid evidence to support these claims." However, the judge wasn't convinced. "Your client's compliance is exactly what's being questioned here, Counselor," she said, her tone sharp. She turned her attention back to the boy. "Is there anything else you'd like to share? Anything about how you feel or what you want?" The boy hesitated, nervously twisting his hands in his lap. After a deep breath, he spoke. "I love Mommy, but I love Daddy too. I just want them to stop fighting." A murmur of sympathy and admiration spread through the courtroom. The judge nodded, her expression softening. "Thank you for being so brave," she said gently. "You've done very well today." But as the boy's heartfelt wish echoed through the room, it was clear that the battle was far from over, at least not yet. The courtroom felt eerily silent after the boy's words. The judge leaned back in her chair, her hands steepled as she carefully observed both parents. The mother looked pale, her once impeccable composure shattered. The father sat frozen, his face a mix of hope and despair. For the first time in the trial, the carefully constructed narratives from both sides began to unravel under the weight of the raw truth. Clearing her throat, the judge spoke, her voice firm but calm. This court takes the well-being of children very seriously. The statements made here today cannot be ignored. She paused before continuing. I am ordering a temporary recess to review the evidence presented and give both parties time to reflect on how their actions have affected this child. She banged her gavel, signaling the break. The room erupted into quiet whispers as people began to leave. The mother quickly moved to her son, crouching to his level. Her voice was low, but strained. Why would you say that, sweetheart? You know I love you. The boy's lips trembled, but he didn't respond. He simply stared down at his shoes, his small shoulders slumping with guilt and confusion. Across the room, the father hesitated before stepping forward. He crouched beside his son, being careful not to invade his space. I'm proud of you, he said softly. That took a lot of courage. The boy looked up, his eyes brimming with tears. I just want you and Mommy to stop being mad. The father's face twisted with emotion as he nodded slowly. I know, buddy, I know. The judge observed the interaction from her bench, her expression thoughtful. When court reconvened, she addressed the room with a sense of finality. I've reviewed the evidence and taken the child's testimony into account. It's clear that the current arrangement is not in the best interest of this boy. The mother inhaled sharply, clutching the edge of the table as the judge continued. Shared custody will be reinstated immediately, with clear guidelines for co-parenting, communication, and counseling for both parties. This child deserves to have both parents in his life, free from manipulation and interference. The mother's lawyer urgently whispered in her ear, but she barely seemed to hear. Her gaze was fixed on her son, who now looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite interpret. Was it relief, sadness, disappointment? The father exhaled deeply, relief washing over him, though the tension in his shoulders didn't completely dissipate. The boy sat quietly, gripping the edge of his seat. He didn't fully understand what had just happened, but he could sense that something had changed. Even as the gavel struck again, signaling the end of the hearing, the real work for the parents, the boy, and everyone who had witnessed the truth coming to light was just beginning. The courtroom slowly emptied, leaving only the echoes of whispered conversations and the soft footsteps of lawyers packing their briefcases. The boy stood between his parents, his small hand clutching his father's, while his mother hovered uncertainly nearby. For a moment, none of them spoke, the weight of the judge's ruling settling over them like a fragile truce. The father crouched down to his son's eye level, a weary smile breaking through his exhaustion. You were really brave today, he said softly. You told the truth, and that's not always easy. The boy's lip quivered, but he nodded. I just don't want anyone to be mad anymore. The father's smile faltered, but he nodded firmly. We'll work on that, I promise. The mother shifted awkwardly, her polished demeanor completely gone. Her makeup was smudged, her blazer hung loose on her slumped shoulders, and her eyes were red. She stepped closer, her voice uncertain. I'm sorry, sweetheart. I shouldn't have said those things. I was wrong. The boy looked at her, his expression unreadable for a moment, then reached out and took her hand. It's okay, Mommy, he whispered. I just want us to be happy. Her words hit her like a physical blow, and for the first time in a long time, genuine remorse filled her eyes as tears spilled down her cheeks. She glanced at the boy's father, who was watching her with a cautious look. We need to do better, she said quietly. He nodded in agreement. I agree, he replied, his tone sincere but weary. Weeks later, the boy's parents were seen sitting together at his school play, exchanging polite smiles as they both filmed his performance on their phones. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. For the boy, it was enough to make him smile, a carefree smile he hadn't shown in months. The lesson was clear: the truth, no matter how difficult, has the power to heal. The courage of a child, free from bitterness or fear, can remind adults of what truly matters. In this case, it was the unwavering love of a little boy that forced two people to confront their flaws and begin the journey toward a better future.